April 16th, 1945. The Harz Mountains, central Germany. The air tasted of cordite and wet earth. In the skeletal remains of what had once been a German field hospital, somewhere between Nordhausen and the advancing American lines, the morning light filtered through shattered rafters like pale fingers reaching into a tomb. The building had no walls on its eastern side, blown away 3 days prior by artillery fire that had announced the arrival of the Ninth Army's 83rd Infantry Division. What remained was a chaos of overturned cots, scattered medical supplies, and the acrid smell of iodine mixed with something far more unsettling: the sweet, cloying odor of gangrene and unwashed bodies trapped in close quarters for too long. Among the ruins moved figures in gray. German nurses, their once crisp uniforms now stained and torn, tried desperately to tend to the wounded men who lay in rows on blood-soaked blankets. Most were Wehrmacht soldiers, some barely 18, others grizzled veterans of the Eastern Front who had been pulled westward in the regime's final, desperate reshuffling. Their groans formed a low chorus, punctuated by sharper cries when a nurse's hands found a wound too deep, too infected, too far gone. The nurses themselves moved like ghosts, hollow-eyed, their hands trembling not just from exhaustion but from something deeper. The knowledge that everything they had been told, everything they had believed, was collapsing around them like the very walls of this hospital. Outside, the rumble of diesel engines grew louder. American half-tracks and jeeps, their white stars brilliant against olive-drab paint, ground to a halt in the muddy courtyard. Doors opened, boots hit the ground, and with them came men who wore red crosses on white armbands, who carried canvas bags marked with the same symbol of mercy that had, until this moment, meant nothing more to these German women than a target the Allies supposedly ignored. What happened next would shatter something fundamental in the minds of these nurses. Something about enemies, about humanity, about the very nature of the war they had served. To understand the shock that registered on the faces of those German nurses when American medics pushed past them and began treating wounded German soldiers with the same urgency they showed their own, and in some cases treating the enemy first, we must first understand what these women had been taught to expect. The education of a German military nurse in 1945 was not merely medical. It was ideological, woven through with the doctrines of racial hierarchy, total war, and the dehumanization of the enemy that had become the Third Reich's operational philosophy. Since 1939, the German military medical system had been built on a foundation of efficiency married to ideology. The Sanitätsdienst, the medical service of the Wehrmacht, was extensive and professional, staffed by doctors and nurses who had received rigorous training in trauma care, surgical intervention, and field medicine. German military nurses, many recruited through the German Red Cross or the National Socialist People's Welfare Organization, were taught to see their work as sacred, not in a humanitarian sense, but in service to the Volk, the German people, and the preservation of Aryan blood. Their medical ethics had been corrupted by years of Nazi indoctrination that drew sharp lines between those worthy of care and those who were not. By 1945, these nurses had seen things that defied comprehension. Many had served on the Eastern Front, where the war against the Soviet Union had devolved into something primal and merciless. There, medical care was often denied to enemy wounded on principle. Soviet prisoners received minimal treatment, if any. Those who survived battle often died in captivity from neglect, starvation, or deliberate execution. The Kommissarbefehl, the Commissar Order of 1941, had explicitly called for the summary execution of Soviet political officers, and this brutality had seeped into the broader treatment of the enemy. German nurses had been conditioned to see the Soviets as Untermenschen, subhuman, and while the Western Allies were not subjected to quite the same venomous propaganda, they were nonetheless portrayed as thugs, criminals in uniform, agents of Jewish plutocracy who would show no mercy to defeated Germans. The German media, controlled entirely by Goebbels' propaganda ministry, had spent years preparing the German people for the worst. Newsreels showed alleged American atrocities. Radio broadcasts spoke of German prisoners tortured, of civilians murdered, of a coming occupation that would be worse than anything imaginable. The nurses had been told, explicitly and implicitly, that the Americans would not honor the Geneva Convention, that the Red Cross on their armbands would be ignored, that capture meant death or worse. They had been taught to expect brutality, to expect their wounded to be left to die, to expect themselves to be treated as combatants despite their medical status. And so, when the Americans arrived at that shattered field hospital in April 1945, the German nurses expected the worst. They expected to be shot, or arrested, or shoved aside while their patients were executed. What they could not expect, what their entire education and experience had not prepared them for, was mercy. The first American medic through the door was a staff sergeant from Brooklyn named Joseph Palermo. He was 24 years old, had landed at Normandy on D-Day +3, and had seen more death in 11 months than most men see in a lifetime. His uniform was filthy, his boots caked with the mud of a dozen German towns, and his medical bag, a canvas satchel marked with a red cross, hung heavy on his shoulder. Behind him came 3 more medics and a battalion surgeon, Major William Hartley, a general practitioner from Iowa who had left his small-town practice in 1942 to join the Army Medical Corps. Palermo's eyes swept the scene in seconds. The professional assessment of a man who had learned to triage in the chaos of combat. He saw the rows of wounded Germans, saw the nurses frozen in place, saw the fear in their eyes. And then he did something that made no sense to those women. He moved directly to the nearest wounded German soldier, a young man with a sucking chest wound who was barely conscious, and knelt beside him. "Get me a chest seal," Palermo called over his shoulder, his hands already working to cut away the man's uniform. Major Hartley moved through the space like a man surveying a broken machine, his physician's mind categorizing wounds, calculating resources, making the cold calculations that battlefield medicine demanded. He stopped beside a German nurse, a woman in her 30s named Margaret Klein, though he would never learn her name, and spoke to her in broken German. "How many wounded?" Klein stared at him. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She had expected a rifle butt, a shouted order, a bullet. Not a question. Not in German. Not with that tone of professional inquiry, doctor to nurse. Hartley repeated the question, softer this time, and Klein found her voice. 56. 4. Hartley nodded, absorbing this. Then he did something that Klein would remember for the rest of her life. He handed her his medical bag. "Help us," he said. The next 3 hours unfolded in a rhythm that defied everything the German nurses understood about war. The American medics did not separate the wounded by nationality. They did not treat their own first as a matter of course. Instead, they moved through the hospital, applying the same principle that governed American military medicine. Priority was determined by severity of injury, not by the uniform the wounded man wore. This was triage in its purest form, a system that the American military had refined to a science over years of global warfare. Army's medical doctrine, outlined in training manuals and drilled into every medic from basic training forward, was explicit: save the savable. The most critically wounded received care first, regardless of rank or, crucially, regardless of whether they were friend or enemy. This was not sentimentality, it was cold pragmatism married to a deeper ethical conviction rooted in the Geneva Convention and the Hippocratic tradition that American medical officers had sworn to uphold. The German nurses watched, stunned, as Palermo worked on that young Wehrmacht soldier with the chest wound, sealing the perforation, establishing an airway, administering morphine with the same care he would show an American GI. Nearby, another medic, a soft-spoken Texan named Calvin Reed, was treating a German officer who had lost his left leg below the knee, applying a tourniquet, packing the stump, speaking in calm, even tones despite the language barrier. The officer, a Hauptmann who had expected execution, wept openly, not from pain but from shock. Major Hartley moved among the wounded with Klein at his side, translating when needed, coordinating the efforts of both American and German medical personnel. He showed the German nurses how the Americans organized their casualty collection points, how they used plasma, a technology the Germans had never mastered at scale, how they stabilized patients for evacuation. The Americans had brought supplies, sulfa drugs, morphine, bandages, plasma bottles in their distinctive containers. They distributed these to the German nurses without hesitation, without counting cost, without demanding anything in return. One German nurse, a young woman named Anna Richter, who had been conscripted into service only 8 months earlier, found herself working alongside an American corpsman named Daniel O'Hara. O'Hara was Irish Catholic from Boston with a rosary tucked into his shirt pocket and a gentleness in his hands that contradicted his linebacker's build. Together they treated a 17-year-old German boy who had taken shrapnel to the abdomen. The boy was dying, both of them knew it, but O'Hara worked anyway, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to ease the pain, while Richter held the boy's hand and whispered to him in German. When the boy died, O'Hara made the sign of the cross over him. Richter would later tell interrogators that this moment broke something inside her. Not broke as in damaged, but broke as in opened, like a dam giving way. She had spent 8 months being taught that the Americans were monsters. And here was this American, this enemy, praying over a dead German soldier he had never met, treating that boy's death as a loss worth mourning. The records of this encounter, like so many moments from the final weeks of the European War, are fragmentary, but they are not unique. What happened in that field hospital near Nordhausen was repeated across Germany in the spring of 1945, documented in after-action reports, medical unit logs, and the testimonies of German prisoners of war interviewed by Allied intelligence officers. The pattern was consistent, and it was shocking to those who experienced it. American medical personnel treated enemy wounded according to need, often before treating their own lightly wounded soldiers, and they did so as a matter of policy, not exception. The 2nd Armored Division's medical battalion recorded treating over 1,400 German wounded in the last 3 weeks of April 1945, many in facilities where American casualties were also present. The division's chief surgeon, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Brennan, noted in his report that German medical personnel were uniformly astonished by American adherence to the Geneva Convention and by the quality and quantity of medical supplies available. They had been told we would shoot prisoners, Brennan wrote. Plasma, that yellowish liquid in glass bottles, became a kind of symbol of the divide between American and German medical capabilities by 1945. The United States had pioneered the mass production and battlefield use of blood plasma, a technology that could keep a wounded man alive when whole blood transfusions were impossible. The process, developed by Dr. Charles Drew and refined by the American Red Cross, allowed plasma to be dried, stored, and reconstituted in the field. By 1945, American medics carried plasma as standard equipment. The Germans had no equivalent system. Their battlefield blood supply was limited to whole blood, which required refrigeration and had a shelf life measured in days, not months. When American medics hung plasma bottles beside German wounded, administering this life-saving fluid without hesitation, it was not just a medical intervention, it was a demonstration of industrial might, of organizational capacity, of a kind of warfighting that prioritized saving lives even as it destroyed armies. The German nurses saw this and understood, perhaps for the first time, the true scale of the disparity between the two nations. But the shock went deeper than technology. It struck at the heart of what these women had been taught about the nature of the enemy and the character of the war. Margaret Klein, the nurse who had been handed Major Hartley's medical bag, would later describe the experience in testimony to British interrogators in June 1945. Her words, preserved in intelligence archives, are striking. We had been told that the Americans were gangsters, that they respected nothing, that they would treat us worse than animals. I had seen what our own men did in Russia. I had served at a field hospital near Minsk in 1943, and I believed that all soldiers were the same when they had the power. But these Americans, they were different. They worked on our wounded as if they were their own brothers. One of their medics, I never learned his name, spent an hour trying to save a Gefreiter who had lost both legs. The boy died anyway, but this American, he cried. He actually cried. I did not understand this. We had been taught that weakness was death, that sentiment was a luxury of peacetime. But this man cried for a German soldier, and then he moved to the next patient and continued working. It was then I realized we had been lied to about everything. This cognitive dissonance, the shattering of expectations so fundamental that they constituted a worldview, was repeated in the testimony of other German medical personnel. Anna Richter, the young nurse who had worked beside Daniel O'Hara, told interrogators, "I thought mercy was something only Germans understood, and only for our own people. The Americans showed me that mercy could be universal. This was not what I had been taught, this was not what the war was supposed to be." And the American medical personnel themselves seemed almost unaware of the impact they were having. To them, what they were doing was simply their job, the execution of doctrine, the fulfillment of the oath they had taken. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had ratified, was explicit. Wounded enemy combatants were to receive the same quality of care as one's own wounded. Army Medical Department had built this principle into its training and its operational procedures. American medics were taught from their first day of training that the Red Cross was a sacred symbol, that medical personnel were non-combatants, and that their duty was to all wounded, regardless of nationality. This was not naivety. American commanders understood that good treatment of enemy wounded had practical benefits. It encouraged surrender, it facilitated intelligence gathering. It demonstrated to German troops that capture by the Americans was preferable to death or capture by the Soviets advancing from the east. But beyond the practical considerations was something else, a commitment to principles that even total war had not entirely eroded, a belief that some standards of humanity must be maintained even in the midst of industrial-scale killing. The contrast with what German medical personnel had experienced and what they had done could not have been starker. The German military medical system, for all its technical proficiency, had been compromised by Nazi racial ideology to the point of criminality. On the Eastern Front, where many of these nurses had served, the treatment of Soviet prisoners and civilians had been a moral catastrophe. German field hospitals routinely refused treatment to Soviet wounded. Those who survived battle often died in captivity from deliberate neglect. The German medical establishment had participated in war crimes, not as aberrations, but as policy. Army doctors had been involved in selecting prisoners for execution, in conducting unethical medical experiments, in implementing the regime's genocidal programs. Even in the West, where the war had been somewhat less barbaric, German treatment of American and British prisoners had been inconsistent at best. While the Geneva Convention was more often observed in dealings with Western POWs than with Soviets, there were documented cases of wounded Allied soldiers being denied adequate medical care, of medical facilities being inadequately supplied, of prisoners dying from treatable conditions due to neglect or deliberate policy. The German nurses working in that shattered field hospital in April 1945 carried this history with them, even if they had not been direct participants in the worst atrocities. They had served in a system that made distinctions, German versus non-German, Aryan versus non-Aryan, deserving versus undeserving, and they had been trained to see these distinctions as natural and necessary. To watch American medics refuse to make such distinctions, to see them treat German soldiers with the same urgency and care they showed their own, was to see a different philosophy in action, one that suggested their entire education had been built on lies. Throughout that long April day, the work continued. The Americans established a proper triage system, separating the wounded into categories: immediate, delayed, minimal, expectant. They radioed for ambulances, for supplies, for a surgical team. They worked alongside the German nurses, showing them techniques, sharing equipment, treating the German medical personnel themselves when they discovered injuries or illnesses the women had been ignoring in order to care for the soldiers. One of the American medics, a quiet man from Oregon named Peter Hoffman, who spoke fluent German, his grandparents had immigrated in the 1890s, served as a translator and liaison. Hoffman moved between the American and German medical personnel, facilitating communication, explaining procedures, answering questions. The German nurses peppered him with questions, their professional curiosity overcoming their fear. Where did the plasma come from? How did the evacuation system work? Why were the Americans using so much morphine? Didn't they know it was in short supply? Hoffman's answers revealed the vast gulf in resources. The plasma came from civilian blood drives in America, millions of donations processed and shipped across the Atlantic. The evacuation system was a well-oiled machine that moved wounded from frontline aid stations to field hospitals to evacuation hospitals to ships bound for England or even back to the United States, all within a matter of days or weeks. Pharmaceutical plants that had been running at full capacity for years. This material abundance was staggering to the German nurses. By April 1945, Germany was starving, its industrial base in ruins, its supply lines shattered by Allied bombing and the advance of armies from east and west. The German military medical system was running on fumes. Short of bandages, short of drugs, short of everything. Morphine was so scarce that German doctors often operated without adequate anesthesia. Sulfa drugs, the miracle antibiotics of the era, were virtually unavailable. Plasma was a dream. And here were the Americans dispensing these precious resources to enemy wounded as if they cost nothing, as if there were an infinite supply, as if saving a German soldier's life was worth the same expenditure as saving an American's. In one corner of the hospital, Major Hartley performed an emergency surgery on a German soldier who had taken a rifle round through the liver. He worked with a German doctor, a weary Stabsarzt named Friedrich Weber, who had been trying to keep the hospital functioning with almost no supplies. Weber assisted, his hands moving with the muscle memory of thousands of procedures, while Hartley directed the operation. They saved the man's life, barely, and when it was over, Weber looked at the American supplies that had made it possible, at the plasma and the sulfa powder and the sterile instruments, and asked Hartley a question. Hartley, exhausted, washing blood from his hands in a basin of cold water, understood the question beneath the question. "Because he's a patient," Hartley said through Hoffman's translation. Weber nodded slowly. He had been a doctor for 20 years, had served in the Wehrmacht since 1939, had operated in field hospitals from Poland to France to Russia, and now back to Germany. He had seen the medical profession corrupted and compromised, had watched as the Hippocratic Oath was subordinated to ideology and expedience. And now, in this ruined building in the dying days of the Reich, an American surgeon was showing him what it looked like when that oath was actually honored. "We were told you were barbarians," Weber said quietly. Hartley looked at him. It was not forgiveness, the crimes of the regime were too vast for that, but it was acknowledgement of a shared humanity that the war had tried to erase. By late afternoon, American ambulances began arriving to evacuate the wounded. The most critical cases would go first, a mix of Americans and Germans, loaded onto stretchers and carried out to waiting vehicles. The German nurses watched as their patients were taken, and for the first time in months, they felt something like hope. These men would receive proper surgical care, would be taken to hospitals with electricity and running water, would be given a chance at survival and recovery. Some of the German nurses were also evacuated, those who were wounded or ill themselves. The Americans discovered that several of the women were suffering from malnutrition, from pneumonia, from infections they had been ignoring. They were treated, given medicine, fed from American rations. One nurse, a woman in her 40s named Elizabeth Braun, who had been vomiting blood for 3 days, was diagnosed with a perforated ulcer. She was loaded into an ambulance and taken to an American field hospital where a surgeon operated and saved her life. Braun would later tell interrogators, "They saved me. I was their enemy. I had been taking care of soldiers who had been trying to kill them. And they saved me. I could not reconcile this with what I had been taught." For those German nurses who remained behind, those who were healthy enough to continue working, the Americans left supplies and instructions. They showed the Germans how to use the plasma, how to administer the sulfa drugs, how to manage their remaining patients until they could be evacuated. Major Hartley left behind most of his medical bag's contents, dividing his supplies among the German medical staff. When Klein protested that he would need these supplies for his own wounded, Hartley shook his head. "We'll get more," he said simply. And he was right. The American logistical system would resupply his unit within 24 hours, would replace everything he had given away, and more. The Germans could not imagine such abundance, such casual generosity with resources that to them were priceless. Before the Americans left, Peter Hoffmann gathered the German nurses together and explained what would happen next. The area was now under American control. The hospital would be reorganized. More supplies would arrive. Those who wished to continue working as medical personnel would be allowed to do so under American supervision. Those who wished to leave would be processed as displaced persons and released. No one would be punished for having served in the German military medical service. The nurses listened in silence. Then one of them, a young woman named Greta Sauer, who had barely spoken all day, asked a question. Hoffmann considered the question. He thought about his grandparents, who had left Germany for America, who had found freedom and prosperity in a new land. He thought about the principles that his country, for all its flaws, tried to uphold. He thought about the difference between a war fought for conquest and domination and a war fought, however imperfectly, for liberation. "Because that's who we are," he said finally. The encounters between American medical personnel and their German counterparts in the spring of 1945 were replicated across the collapsing Reich. In Bavaria, in the Rhineland, in Thuringia and Saxony, as American armies swept eastward, they overran German hospitals and found the same pattern: shocked German medical staff, wounded German soldiers expecting the worst, and American medics who treated them according to the same standards they applied to their own. The 45th Infantry Division, fighting its way through southern Germany, documented treating more than 2,000 German wounded in a 2-week period. The 1st Infantry Division, advancing toward the Elbe River, converted a German military hospital into an Allied facility where American and German wounded lay in adjacent beds, receiving identical care. Army Medical Department tell part of the story. Between January and May 1945, American medical units in Europe treated approximately 45,000 German prisoners of war and civilian casualties. The mortality rate among these German patients was actually lower than the overall mortality rate for German wounded in Wehrmacht hospitals during the same period, a testament not just to American medical skill, but to the resources available to American doctors and medics. But numbers alone cannot capture what this meant to the individuals who experienced it. For the German nurses and doctors, the encounter with American military medicine was often a revelation that extended beyond medical practice into the realm of ideology and values. They had been taught that National Socialism represented the pinnacle of modern civilization, that German organizational skills and German science were superior to anything the decadent democracies could produce. What they had discovered was that the democracies, and particularly America, had out-organized, outproduced, and in many ways out-thought the Reich, and had done so while maintaining ethical principles that the Nazi regime had abandoned. The symbolic weight of medical supplies, of plasma and morphine, of sulfa powder and sterile bandages, carried meanings that extended far beyond their immediate medical utility. These items represented the industrial and organizational might of the United States, a nation that could wage war on 3 continents while simultaneously maintaining a standard of medical care that the Germans, for all their vaunted efficiency, could not match. American military medicine in World War II was a triumph of logistics and planning. The system that delivered plasma to a medic treating wounded in a German field hospital began with civilian blood drives in American cities, continued through processing plants that dried and packaged the plasma, shipping networks that transported it across the Atlantic, supply depots in England and France that stored and distributed it, and finally the supply trucks and jeeps that brought it to the front lines. This system moved millions of units of plasma, billions of doses of medicine, untold tons of bandages and surgical supplies, and did so reliably, continuously, throughout years of global warfare. The German nurses saw the end result of this system and understood, perhaps for the first time, what they were up against. The plasma bottle hanging beside a wounded German soldier was not just medical equipment. It was a symbol of a kind of power that had nothing to do with tanks or aircraft, though it was intimately connected to them. It was the power of abundance, of organization, of a society wealthy and capable enough to care for even its enemies. This abundance struck at the heart of Nazi propaganda, which had always portrayed America as weak, decadent, divided, incapable of the kind of total mobilization that the Reich had achieved. The reality experienced firsthand by those German nurses in April 1945 was precisely the opposite. America had mobilized more completely, more effectively, and more humanely than Germany had. It had produced more of everything: weapons, vehicles, ships, aircraft, and yes, medical supplies. And it had done so without abandoning the principles of human dignity that the Nazi regime had deemed obstacles to total war. For some of the German nurses, the encounter with American medical ethics prompted a deeper reckoning with their own complicity in the regime's crimes. Not all German medical personnel were war criminals. Many were simply doing their jobs, trying to save lives in horrific circumstances. but they had served in a system that made moral compromises, that prioritized some lives over others, that had participated in evil. Margaret Klein, the nurse who had been given Major Hartley's medical bag, would spend the rest of her life wrestling with what she had seen and done. In interviews conducted decades after the war, she spoke of her time in Russia, of the Soviet prisoners who had been denied care, of the choices that had seemed necessary at the time but which haunted her afterward. Meeting the Americans, she said, forced her to confront those choices in a new light. I had told myself that we were doing what we had to do, that war was cruel and that our first duty was to our own, she said in a 1973 interview. But when I saw the Americans treat our wounded, when I saw them give their medicine and their care to men who had been killing Americans just hours before, I realized that what I had told myself was a lie. There were choices. We could have chosen differently. Not all German medical personnel experienced such a profound moral awakening. Some remained committed Nazis, unmoved by American generosity, convinced to the end that the regime had been right and that Germany's defeat was a cosmic injustice. But many others found their worldviews shaken, their certainties undermined by the simple act of witnessing enemy medics honor the principles that their own side had discarded. Anna Richter, the young nurse who had worked beside the American corpsman Daniel O'Hara, would eventually immigrate to the United States in 1952. She became a nurse in a Pittsburgh hospital, married an American veteran, and lived quietly until her death in 1989. She rarely spoke of the war, but when she did, she always returned to that moment when O'Hara had made the sign of the cross over the dying German boy. That was when I understood, she told her daughter. That was when I knew that everything I had been taught was wrong, and that the side I had served had been evil. The Americans were supposed to be my enemies, but they showed me more humanity in one day than I had seen in years of serving the Reich. The treatment of German medical personnel and wounded by American forces in the closing months of the war was not universally exemplary. There were incidents of abuse, of neglect, of anger overcoming discipline. War is chaos, and even the best trained soldiers sometimes fail to live up to their principles. But the pattern was clear enough and consistent enough to constitute a policy rather than an exception. American military medicine in World War II was guided by principles that, however imperfectly applied, represented a commitment to human dignity even in the midst of total war. This commitment had roots in American legal traditions, in the Geneva Convention that the United States had ratified, in the Hippocratic Oath that military doctors swore alongside their oath to defend the Constitution. But it also reflected something deeper about American self-conception, about the idea, however often betrayed in practice, that all human beings possessed certain inalienable rights, that even enemies retained their humanity, that victory was meaningless if it required becoming what one fought against. The German nurses who encountered American military medicine in April 1945 became witnesses to this philosophy in action. They saw principles embodied in practice, saw ideology translated into morphine and plasma and sterile bandages. They saw mercy not as weakness but as strength, saw humanity not as sentimentality but as a fundamental commitment that could coexist with, indeed could enhance, military effectiveness. The shock they experienced was the shock of discovering that the world was not what they had been taught it was, that their enemies were not monsters, that mercy was not a luxury reserved for peacetime. It was the shock of cognitive dissonance, of watching behavior that contradicted everything their propaganda had promised. And for many, it was the beginning of a long and painful process of understanding what they had served and what they had done. In the decades after the war, historians and psychologists studied the German experience of American occupation and found patterns that echoed what those nurses had experienced in April 1945. Germans who had been prepared for brutality encountered instead an occupying power that, while far from perfect, treated them with a measure of decency and fairness that shocked those who had absorbed Nazi propaganda. The American commitment to rebuilding rather than simply punishing, the Marshall Plan's economic assistance, the relatively lenient treatment of ordinary Germans who had supported the regime, all of this contradicted what Germans had been told to expect. The encounter between German nurses and American medics in those field hospitals was a microcosm of this larger experience. It was the meeting of two systems, two philosophies, two different answers to the question of what human beings owe to one another even in the extremity of war. The American answer, imperfect, sometimes contradictory, but rooted in principles of universal human dignity, prevailed not just militarily but morally. The plasma bottles, the morphine syringes, the sulfa packets. These material objects became symbols of a different kind of society, one that could produce abundance while maintaining ethical constraints, one that could wage total war without totally abandoning humanity. The German nurses who saw American medics treating enemy wounded with the same care they showed their own witnessed the visible proof that democracy and abundance were not signs of weakness, but sources of strength. Epilogue. When the war ended 3 weeks after that April day in the Harz Mountains, Margaret Klein found herself in a displaced persons camp, awaiting processing and uncertain of her future. She carried with her almost nothing. Her nurse's uniform had been exchanged for civilian clothes. Her few possessions fit into a small bag. But she also carried something less tangible, a memory of an American major handing her his medical bag, trusting her, treating her as a colleague despite the uniform she wore. Years later, in the 1960s, Klein would work in a hospital in Frankfurt where the chief of surgery was a former Wehrmacht doctor who had also served on the Eastern Front. They rarely spoke of the war, but one evening as they prepared for a difficult operation, he asked her if she remembered the end, the Americans, the chaos, the collapse. "I remember the medics," she said. The surgeon nodded. "I saw the same." Bam. What they had witnessed was not just military medicine. It was a demonstration of principles under pressure, of values maintained even when maintaining them was costly and difficult. The American medics who treated German wounded in April 1945 were not saints. They were tired, often frightened young men doing a job under appalling conditions. But they were guided by a system, by a set of principles, by a commitment to standards that transcended nationality and enmity. The shock that German nurses experienced when they encountered this commitment was the shock of discovering that the world contained more goodness than they had been taught to expect, that their enemies were more human than their propaganda had allowed, that mercy was not weakness but a form of strength. In that moment, in that ruined field hospital, something fundamental shifted. The barriers erected by years of propaganda, by ideology and hatred and fear, were pierced by a simple act of professional medical care. The German nurses looked at their American counterparts and saw not enemies but colleagues, not invaders but healers. They saw people who had chosen, even in the midst of total war, to honor principles that made them human. That choice, to treat the wounded regardless of uniform, to see patients rather than enemies, to maintain standards of medical ethics even when doing so was costly and difficult, was not naive. It was not weakness. It was the decision, made and remade every day by thousands of American medical personnel, to refuse to let war erase their humanity. It was the commitment to principles that existed above and beyond the contingencies of battle that asserted human dignity even in the face of industrial-scale killing. The German nurses who witnessed this carried that memory forward into the decades of peace that followed. Some spoke of it openly, some kept it private, but all were marked by it, by the experience of discovering that the world was not what they had been taught, that their enemies had been better than their own side, that there were standards of decency that transcended nationality and ideology. In the end, that may be the most enduring lesson of those encounters in the spring of 1945, that even in the darkest moments, even in the depths of total war, it was possible to maintain one's humanity. The Americans who treated German wounded, who gave their plasma and morphine and care to enemy soldiers, proved that mercy was not incompatible with military effectiveness, that principles could be maintained without compromising victory. They proved, in short, that some things were worth preserving even in the fire of war, that human dignity was not a peacetime luxury but a fundamental value that defined who they were and what they fought for. The German nurses saw this truth embodied in plasma bottles and morphine syringes, in gentle hands and professional care, in the simple act of enemy medics kneeling beside enemy wounded and doing everything in their power to save them. It was a truth that shattered propaganda and pierced ideology, a truth delivered not in words but in actions, in the concrete reality of medical care extended without conditions, without qualifications, without the barriers that war had tried to erect. It was the truth that even in the worst of times, humanity could be chosen, mercy could be practiced, and dignity could be preserved. And that truth, witnessed in a ruined field hospital in April 1945, echoed forward through the decades, a reminder that the highest victories are not just military but moral, that what matters most is not just winning the war, but preserving, in the act of winning, the values that make victory meaningful. The plasma bottle, hanging beside a wounded German soldier, sustained not just a life, but a principle. And that principle, that human dignity transcends nationality, that mercy is strength, that even enemies remain human, was perhaps the most important weapon the Americans carried into that war and the most enduring legacy they left behind.